Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. Today we have a special guest, Philippe Van Parijs, joining us. We recently finished reading his book that he co-wrote with Yannick van der Voort, entitled Basic Income, A Radical Proposal for a Free Society and a Sane Economy. So welcome to the discussion, Philippe. So Philippe is a political philosopher in Belgium, and he's been involved with basic income since the 1980s, so around 40 years, maybe at this point, maybe even longer, I don't know, depending on when you started thinking about it. And we have discussed, of course, the book. We've also done one of these on your 1986 article, A Capitalist Road to Communism. So we talked about that for a little while. Personally, I became interested in basic income about 10 years ago, and you, Philippe, were the person who introduced me to the term basic income when I read your chapter in the Redesigning Distribution book put together by Eric Olin-Wright. So that was my first exposure to the term basic income. And I really loved the way you defined it. And that was exactly what I had been thinking about, right? It's this unconditional income that goes to everyone with no obligations, no work requirement, no means test. And I particularly liked that the amount of money wasn't part of the definition, because that allowed us to think about the mechanism on its own or separately from thinking about, what the best amount would be for the economy, that kind of thing. So I love that definition. I actually sat in on your session at the BN Congress a few weeks ago, where you were talking about what should the definition of basic income be? Should we change it? That kind of thing. And I was thinking to myself, gosh, I hope they don't change it, because then I'll have to start using a different term for the thing that I've been calling basic income. So I think, you were instrumental in putting together the Basic Income Earth Network, which is the Basic Income European Network at first. And you kind of got the whole, or were one of the main people in getting the whole modern basic income movement going, and you were my introduction to it. So it's really an honor and a privilege to have you here. So this book, you wrote another book. You've written a few books, but the one I'm thinking of is Real Freedom for All, and that was a long time ago. And this is kind of the latest. And I've noticed that throughout kind of everything you've written, that you frame the need for basic income in terms of freedom. So is the idea of freedom necessary for understanding basic income? And another way of framing this is, or an angle we can take at it is, in a world that already has basic income, a hypothetical world, will the people in that world be thinking of their basic income as an instrument of freedom?
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much to the whole reading group for having spent time reading the book. Perhaps not everyone every page, but of course it's for that sort of reader that we write this sort of book. And to answer your question, well, of course you can explain what a basic income is without using the term freedom. You can just explain the mechanics of it. You can explain or also justify it without using the term freedom, just by saying, for example, that it's a more effective way of addressing the problem of poverty. But my conviction is that the best way of justifying a basic income as a first best, rather than as a pragmatic solution or the best pragmatic solution to a particular problem, is in terms of freedom. And I was struck, through countless discussions I've had in various languages and on the 6 continents or so, that in fact, the people who you could only see basic income as a great idea rather than just as a clever idea, if you attached great importance to freedom. And in particular, it struck me that, say, on the left, you really have sort of two sorts of people. You have the people who really are in favor of equality, but combined with the importance of labor, of work, And you have other people who are also attach great importance to equality, which is the defining feature of the left, but combined with freedom. And it's the latter category that find basic income so attractive, whereas the former category needs quite a bit of convincing before they start taking the idea of basic income seriously, given the importance they attach to work. Then as regards your second question, which is, will once a basic income is in place, will people still think about it as freedom? Well, certainly not all the time, because once we have acquired a certain type of freedom, certain freedom at a certain level, we still...
I'm actually getting some audio. I'm hearing you twice. I don't. Is this on my end, or is anyone else getting this?
I'm not having that problem. It's fine.
All right, I'll try to figure it out.
Okay. Let me know when I can continue.
Yeah, hold on a second. I figured it out. Okay, we're good.
Okay, so your second question was, well, will people think about basic income in terms of freedom once it's introduced? Well, you really only perceive what freedoms you enjoy when they are threatened or when they disappear. And so, well, the sort of freedom you have with a basic income, because of its being obligation-free, it means that if you give up a job which you don't like, where you are badly treated, you still have enough to live on because you keep receiving this basic income. And if suddenly you are told, oh, sorry, if you give up a job voluntarily, then you won't have any income. So suddenly you'll feel imprisoned and you'll feel incarcerated in the job you have because you can't leave it without also leaving your means of livelihood. And similarly, if basic income being universal, being combinable with income from another source, well, if suddenly you are told that, well, if you take a job, then you lose your income. And so you have all the uncertainties related to taking a low-paid job, perhaps an uncertain job, and then suddenly you feel then imprisoned in your situation of exclusion because you don't dare to leave the certainty of your benefit because of its conditionality. And so I think once you enjoy a particular freedom, you lose sight of it until it is threatened. And so from time to time, people will realize how much of a freedom they enjoy thanks to this basic income once it's introduced.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if you have all the freedom that you need, you're not really thinking about freedom that much. That's not what you're thinking about. That makes sense to me. I wonder, in terms of basic income, if obviously, if the way we get people money is restrictive, then that hurts people's freedoms. And maybe that's a compelling argument to bring up. But are there things that, I guess you brought up the problem of poverty. That's something that also breaks, if we don't have an efficient way of getting people money. I wonder if freedom is fundamental to basic income, or if it's one of the effects of the diminishment of freedom is one of the effects of not having a reasonable way to get people money. Do you think of freedom more as like kind of the most compelling problem that people face today that can kind of call attention to the fact that basic income is a better way of getting people money, or do you think of it as like the part of the fundamental nature of basic income itself?
Well, of course, there are many aspects to the freedom that is given to basic income, and so some people will be primarily concerned with the problem of exclusion linked to the poverty trap. So even in the countries like mine, where you have a developed welfare state, you have a situation in which the people on benefit are often stuck in that situation because there is really no job that they could take, and because they could only take part-time jobs because of their psychological situation or their family situation. And so there is no job they could take that would pay at least as much as what they get on benefit. And for that reason, then they're stuck in that situation of exclusion. And it's not really possible for the authorities, we have this debate at the moment in Belgium, to raise the level of the conditional social assistance, because the trap would get deeper as a result. And so some people are concerned by that aspect of the freedom, the exclusion that is suffered by people who are poor, who could do some jobs, but for whom it wouldn't make sense to do the sort of jobs which they could really do, given their skills and the constraints on their time. And but other people then are more concerned about the fact that some people are stuck in a situation in which they have to work a lot doing a job they don't like, that doesn't make much sense to them, and can't leave that job because they couldn't possibly work on a part-time basis, because they couldn't take the sort of job they would like to do, are not reliable enough or don't pay enough for them to be able to abandon the job in which they feel stuck. And so people may come to the idea of basic income through various paths, in different ways, but to describe them, you don't necessarily need the term freedom, but much of what underlies the motivation, in fact, is related to these various dimensions of the freedom which a basic income would give.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, I kind of want to ask your question maybe in a slightly different way, or with different framing. So I also agree that freedom is a major benefit, and I'm wondering if it's kind of the defining benefit that distinguishes basic income from other solutions to similar problems, like you're kind of describing with the welfare state. Or again, I guess I'm also wondering, instead, should we think of freedom as the most important benefit of basic income from a persuasion context, but that maybe happens to do with has to do with kind of what people are persuaded by right now and kind of where people are already coming from politically. And if they were coming from a different perspective, maybe we would emphasize a different benefit, like reduction of poverty or something like that. So it's basically just a reframing of Alex's question about whether we should think of freedom as kind of the fundamental defining benefit of basic income as a policy, or one of many that we kind of want to highlight right now because of what persuades people. Does that question make sense?
Yeah. Well, yeah. No, I think you are right that some people will be devote their lives to reducing the level of poverty, and so improving the situation of people who are in a very bad material situation, and then they want to do that in a way that doesn't stigmatize the people, and so that preserves their dignity, and so that in some cases, so they would sort of formulate their fight for a basic income rather in terms of achieving dignity for everyone rather than freedom. And so now, and when you get through, I mean, when you try to understand what's behind all that, well, in the end, this dignity is also related to the freedom you give to these people. And so it's because they are not in a situation which they have to prove that they are poor, that they are not, that the reason why they are poor is not really their own fault and all this, but in fact, the reason why basic income respects their dignity or helps them achieve dignity while getting out of poverty has to do with this freedom, which is related to the three features that distinguish basic income from the standard social assistance, which is the fact that it's strictly individual. So we don't need to go and see with whom you live in order to decide whether you are entitled to it. It's not means tested, so we don't need to to take it away as soon as you have an income from another source. We don't need to investigate your situation, your wealth, etc. And the third one is the obligation freeness. And so for all, so that although the rhetorics and the packaging of basic income may appeal to different people in different ways. So the best way of selling the idea to different sorts of people may differ considerably, and freedom may not always be the best track. I think that when you sort of go through and scrutinize what the nature of the argument, well, one way or another, it will be related to the real freedom that is linked to each of the three unconditionalities that define basic income and distinguish it from the standard welfare state benefits.
I guess I'll just, that makes sense to me. And I guess I'll just follow up with, in terms of what stands out initially, I think it depends on what people are mentally comparing it to. So even between the United States and Belgium, there's a different sort of baseline that it's being compared to. Maybe it's being compared to pretty robust welfare state that's kind of restrictive versus just no money or a lot of like homelessness. So that's different things will stand out. Or if you're thinking in your mind about a jobs guarantee as an alternative, then different things stand out, maybe more the freedom and less just the money that you're getting, because you get money in a jobs guarantee too. So I think where people are coming from initially obviously depends on the salient kind of mental alternative that they're considering, whether it be just nothing or one of these other alternatives like welfare or a job guarantee or something like that.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. And of course, it's even more true when you think about the introduction of a basic income in Kenya, as it's being experimented now in India, where it was experimented in a state in the past. So that in those cases, well, I mean, the effect of a basic income would be roughly similar to the introduction even of a pretty conditional guaranteed income scheme. So I fully agree with what you said, that it depends on the context, and the argument in terms of freedom makes more sense and is more persuasive and more important in a situation in which you already have a pretty developed welfare state.
Yeah, and I noticed in the book that you're often comparing basic income to other aspects of the welfare state, to social protection programs, that kind of thing. And maybe we can, by default, assume that basic income is solving the same problems that these other programs are trying to solve, with the added benefit that it's compatible with freedom. So maybe you're kind of in the back of your mind thinking, oh, we're trying to do all this stuff, but it's missing the freedom component. And then basic income is what allows us to add that back in. Is that kind of how you think about it a little bit?
Yes, but that's true. But of course, part of the argument is that it's not just that it adds freedom to the other objectives that can be to a large extent achieved by the existing schemes, but it's also that even, for example, in terms of the objective of abolishing or reducing poverty, that basic income performs better, because I mean, a number of standard arguments, one of them being the rate of take-up, and that because it's given automatically ex ante to the people, so you don't have people who are stuck then in complicated procedures, who don't get it at all or get it too late, or simply because many of the people who need it most are people who are least well equipped in order to go through all the procedures that are needed in some countries in order to get the conditional benefits. So that it's not only that you have all these things that may be achieved to some extent by the existing schemes, and then you say, and now you have freedom in addition. But even for the sake of reducing poverty, there are all these advantages, both the rate of take-up and then the poverty trap that are claimed to be solved by the introduction of a basic income, the replacement of part of the existing system by a basic income.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point, because it raises the question, what are these other schemes attempting to accomplish, or what problem are they really trying to solve? And I think, we could ask the same question about other economic policy that we don't typically think of as part of a social protection scheme or something like that. Like, why do we have pro-employment policy, that kind of thing? Is basic income, do you think of basic income primarily as an alternative to welfare state, social protection, stuff that's supposed to address poverty, or can it be broader than that? Is it an alternative also to using economic policy to create jobs, that kind of thing?
It's certainly that too, but I mean, as I said earlier, so the most fundamental first best justification of basic income is in terms of providing people with real freedom. People with least real freedom would be given more real freedom. So it means the most fundamental justification is that we are using our economic capacities not to try to make people work as much as possible, to provide them as much employment as possible, to provide them as much income as possible. No, it's there to emancipate people. And so that's the basic message. But of course, in order to do that, it also has to provide security, therefore social protection. And in that capacity, it is an alternative or a complement to the other two existing forms of social protection. One, and that's our historical chapter, or the first of our two historical chapters. And so one, social assistance, assistance to the poor, aid to the poor, appeared in the 16th century. And the other one, which is solidarity between the workers in the form of social insurance, appeared at the end of the 19th century. They both serve social protection, providing basic security to the people, and basic income does that too, but in a different way. And so that you can see basic income as performing that function, even though its fundamental justification is of a different kind. But of course, to provide this real freedom for all, you need to provide basic security to all, which to some extent in a different way was done by the other two forms of social protection, social assistance and social insurance.
Would you say that the purpose of the economy as a whole is to provide real freedom for all to the greatest extent possible, and that basic income is a component of the economy that helps it work efficiently, provide freedom efficiently, or something like that? Is that a reasonable way to frame it?
Well, there is a famous sentence by the Marquis de Condorcet, so one of the inspirers and actors of the French Revolution. And he says, what the sentence says, what is the aim of politics? The first aim, he said, is justice. The second one is justice. And the third one is justice again. And so for me, the fundamental, and the first, and to quote also John Rawls, and the first virtue of social institutions is social justice. But then you have to spell out what social justice is. And my own answer to the question of what social justice is encapsulated in the title of the book, the earlier book you mentioned, Real Freedom for All. And so that, I'm strongly against seeing justice as being opposed to freedom. No, justice is about the fair distribution of freedom. And our various institutions, including, of course, the institutions that organize, that govern our economic life, must be guided by that objective of providing justice, and of course justice across generations. So it must be the sustainable provision of the greatest possible real freedom to those with least of it. So that's the overarching objective.
So justice is real freedom for all. You don't have justice unless you have that. Go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, so you're probably going to bring this up later, Alex, but Philippe, when you were mentioning the other protections, I was thinking of how Alex thinks of one that is a little bit different or additional to those that some people wouldn't think of as a protection for security. But Alex, you talk a lot about like basically interest rates and monetary policy as trying to give people jobs as well, which I think of as slightly different than labor union movements and things like that. So the idea would be that, and just general policies that try to include creating jobs, like, oh, we'll fix our infrastructure and create jobs. So that might end up in a policy that is less efficient and thus creates more work for people. So that's one thing you talk about. And then another is, like I said, keeping interest rates such that the financial sector pumps a lot of credit into the economy and maybe sustains businesses that otherwise wouldn't be efficient or wouldn't be sustained. So those are ways of also promoting job security in a certain sense that maybe most of us don't think of that way. And so I guess I just wanted to add that to the picture. And I was curious, Philippe, what you thought about that, and if basic income could be an alternative to that, because that's something that Alex talks a lot about that I haven't heard as many other basic income supporters talk about.
Yes.
I'm not sure if that made sense, but
it does make sense. So you could say, well, I mean, indeed, that's a view that is held by a significant part of the left, I think, in all developed countries, certainly, which considers saying, well, the only way in which you can provide security in a sustainable way is through providing jobs to people. And in a way, it was the standard mantra in post-war, after the Second World War. And how could you do that? Well, I mean, largely through macroeconomic policy. You just have a full employment policy, and so whatever means you use, public works, money creation, and so monetary policy, and so you do that. Then one realized that you couldn't really do that in order to really get everyone into employment. And then you had a number of other schemes that were developed, sometimes tried. I mean, the most systematic and neatly developed proposal of that sort is Ned Phelps' book, Rewarding Work, where realizing that macroeconomic policy won't do that. I mean, full employment job. So you just have massive job subsidies. And then, but I mean, we discussed this proposal in the book, I think in chapter 2, and then and there's this phrase which Phelps likes, which is the business of America is busyness. And so a quote from one of your former presidents, and yes, but and that's where you have Phelps can be regarded as someone on the left, liberal in the American sense, and quite liked by John Rawls, for example, and but that is then this tension where you say, well, is the best way to liberate people, to make them free, work? And so where work is what provides them with an income, and this relationship with work needs to be kept, because paid work, understand it, paid work, waged work is part of what people need in order to liberate themselves? Or do you say, no, what matters is really freedom, including the freedom to choose what you do with your life? So that is what sort of work you are going to do, whether you work part-time or full-time, do an artistic job or a job that really pays enough for you to live on, etc. And so, and that's the tension between the labor-focused and then the freedom-focused left. In both cases, you could say, well, we want a more egalitarian society, and we want a society, therefore, in which poverty would be abolished, where everyone, even the least well-equipped, would have access to an income. But there is no reason, and the people who defend basic income as the first best, we say there is no reason why we should give a privilege to waged work as the key for access to secure income. And let's do it in the straightest way, give income to the people.
Yeah, if you're forcing people to work as an excuse to pay them, you're not maximizing their freedom, and you're also employing them for a reason other than the product of their labor. So you're not maximizing, economic output either. One way I like to think about it is that in some sense, since we use economic policy to create jobs, the jobs already are a form of of government handouts. So we're handing people money. It's just hidden behind the fact that we're handing people jobs. But it's also not, like you said, it's not going to everyone. It's not evenly distributed. People get left behind, and it feels like a pretty big inefficient mess that we have in our economy right now that we wouldn't need. You know, we can do basic income instead of that. Would you say that's accurate?
Well, it's certainly in the view that was defended by this American union leader, who we quote at some length precisely in the section devoted to that, where he said, initially I was in favor of a formula of guaranteed employment.
Talking about Andy Stern.
Sorry? Yes, Stern.
Andy Stern, yeah.
And then I thought through it. I mean, especially as a union leader, that was quite intuitive, quite appealing to go that way. And then he realized all the difficulties that were related to that. And we've had schemes of that sort, and in various European countries where you had for the people. I mean, it was nearly equivalent to a right to some sort of public employment for anyone who couldn't find a job in the private sector. But as we also mentioned in the book, in fact, you had then, there was a stigma attached to that sort of job, because these people were the people who took these jobs were the people who were then perceived as not being good enough to get a real job. And so they were given this thing, and then often, because anyway it was a subsidized job, there was not much care taken of their training, of their supervision. After all, I mean, whether they did anything or not, given that they were only paid by a subsidy that came from the state, it didn't really matter. So I mean, for that reason and the other reasons we mentioned, and including the inefficiency that creeps into the system, and so we quote also a number of, because it's an old attempt. It goes back also to the poor laws and the workhouses in England in the early 19th century, where this was done. You said the poor can't just get an income, we'll make them work. It was more costly to make them work than to give them the income. And more stigmatizing and more humiliating often for the people who were treated like slaves.
Yeah. And it's interesting that, you know, a union leader like Andy Stern would come around to something like basic income, because that's hard to do if you've built your identity around labor and joining people together based on the fact that they're workers who have jobs, and, you know, that kind of, as you pointed out in the book, you know, getting basic income on the agenda of unions is almost a conflict of interest, because it undermines the very principles on which they're founded, that their value comes from being workers, that kind of thing. And that can be tough. I'm curious, how has you've been involved with basic income for a long time. How has your understanding or thinking about basic income changed since you were first writing about it in the 1980s, and maybe even since you published this book in 2017?
Yeah, well, there were some early changes. So the idea came to me in 1982, and I underestimated at the time the ethical dimension, the moral dimension, and I overestimated, or at least I thought for a long time that I overestimated the migration difficulty, the international mobility. And so initially I really couldn't see what could be objected to the idea on moral grounds. I mean, you just had these poor people, and you improved the life of poor people, and in a pretty obvious way. So who could object to that? And then I always remember a debate. So in 1985, I then was a visiting lecturer at the University of Amsterdam in Holland. And in Holland, Holland was the only country in which there was a real public debate about basic income in the early 1980s. And I had to moderate a debate between a Marxist economist, and a member of the leadership of the Dutch Labour Party, which at the time was the biggest party in the Netherlands, and a debate on basic income. And so the Marxist economist explained basic income is a fantastic idea. It's it's the foreshadowing the realm of freedom, where people will be where the product will be distributed according to people's needs, and people will contribute voluntarily. It's a fantastic idea, but alas, it's completely unfeasible under capitalism, because capitalists won't like this idea that gives people the freedom not to work, not to sell their labor power. So forget it. It's a very nice idea, but it will never be realized. And then the member of the leadership of the Labour Party spoke and said, "Oh, come on. You Marxists, you've been telling us that it would be impossible to have universal suffrage. We Social Democrats realized it. You said we couldn't have a regulation of labor market. We did it. You said we couldn't have social insurance. We did it. Basic income, of course, we could do it if we wanted to, but never. It would be scandalous to introduce such an unjust scheme, because access to an income must be reserved to the people who work, if they are able to work. You can only have an income without working if either you have worked enough in the past as a pension, or you are unable to work. And it would be scandalous. It would be a moral scandal. So I thought, oh, there is a job to do for a philosopher. And but I thought it was already done, because I thought that John Rawls' theory of justice provided there to a second principle, his distributive principle with its two parts, and it seemed to me obvious that this was a straight justification of basic income. And then I met Rawls in 1987, and that's where the discussion about the Malibu surfers came, and Rawls didn't think at all that the people who choose not to work should get an income. He modified his difference principle, so his principle of distributive justice, in order to deprive these Malibu surfers of access to an income without work. And so, and that led to then my attempt to justify basic income in a systematic way in the book that then took more years than I expected it to take, and that became Real Freedom for All. So that's one way in which, and so at the very beginning I thought this is unproblematic, morally speaking, and then I realized it was, in fact, the most emotional objections to basic income are of a moral type. It's not a question of whether it can be funded, or whether it actually reduces poverty, etc. It's really whether it's acceptable to give something for nothing. And the other way in which I changed my mind, what I thought was initially was the hardest thing, especially for a small country like mine, was migration. Was if you introduce basic income, want people come from elsewhere to come and get the basic income without working, and so it would be unsustainable. And then I met then quite early the chief of cabinet of the employment minister in Belgium, who said, no, that's not a problem, because we have exactly the same problem with the social assistance. Social assistance is not related to social contributions paid earlier, so anyone in principle who is entitled to it if they don't have a job. Of course, there are all these conditions attached to it, but that's not the issue in terms of feasibility or attractiveness. Even with all these conditions, it's attractive for people who come from elsewhere, where the situation is worse than in relatively wealthy countries like ours. And he said, but we solve it in a pragmatic way, because you can only come in from outside if you have a right to live in Belgium, and you can only have the right to live in Belgium, or in any other, if you have the right to work in Belgium, and you only have the right, are given the right to work in Belgium if you already have a job. So that the there was a condition you could impose on people coming in. Now, this no longer applies as easily now that we have the European Union with free circulation, but there are still conditions of this sort. So when you move from one country of the EU, of the European Union to another, you are not immediately entitled to social assistance. You have to wait for 5 years. And so you could say, well, the same would apply to a basic income. It's not very neat. It's not very nice but it's essential in order to preserve the system. But what more recently, and you asked me also after the more recent book, so this is all from my early thinking about it in 1980s, but one thing a problem which I didn't perceive as sharply as I do now is another problem about migration, which is if this basic income, you give it to all the people who live in the country. But what does it mean to live in the country? If you go on holiday for a month, of course, you keep it. But what if you go on holiday for 6 months in a country where it's cheaper to live? Or what if you go and study abroad for 3 years? Are you still entitled to it? And so that, and all this, these are tricky problems to solve in principle, and even trickier to implement in practice. How do you control all this? How do you check that? And in a way, on the pragmatic side, rather than the theoretical side, so the Achilles heel of a basic income may be less the problematic attraction for the people who are coming from elsewhere than the preservation of the right to a basic income for people who live elsewhere, allegedly or really on a temporary basis. For how long can you remain entitled to a basic income once you no longer live in the country? And how do you control whether you actually live in the country when, like in the European Union, the borders, there are no longer, the borders have disappeared, and so you just cross borders without any control. So these are just two elements, where my thinking about it changed, and some very pragmatic and some of a more fundamental sort.
People really do have a strong aversion to giving people money for nothing. I wonder how flexible that psychology is. If we shift into a world where it starts to become more normal, or as it becomes more normal for people to get benefits, do we think maybe there'll gradually be less aversion to that over time?
Well, what I'm sure you've experienced that also in the US. In fact, the objection disappears when it looks like, or when the framing is such that the money is not coming from people's work, but it's coming from typically a natural resource. So the Alaska Permanent Fund is a typical example where there is, it enjoys very wide legitimacy, despite the fact that you think this money could be used for better purposes, for the education system, whatever, rather than being distributed equally to all. But it's not regarded as problematic. You say, well, this is something that, wealth that has been generated by oil that happened to be on the soil of Alaska, and we just share it equally between everyone in the country. So even if it were used for some services rather than in the form of cash, it would still be regarded as something that it's wealth that is shared by all, and that is then distributed possibly in different ways to all, or to whatever the form it takes. And another analogous way in which people see a basic income is as unproblematically legitimate as a carbon dividend, where you say, well, look, our atmosphere cannot swallow all the pollution we would, all the emissions we would generate if we didn't have to pay for the generation of these emissions. And so if we make people pay so as to not to exceed the threshold of what can be digested by the atmosphere in a way that doesn't create danger for our planet, well, the proceeds from selling these emission rights or from taxing the emission of carbon is something that could be shared equally by everyone, I mean, strictly speaking, by everyone on Earth, but even when it's introduced as proposed by 1,000 economists or so in the US, even if it's introduced at the level of a single country, the idea of distributing this money as a carbon dividend is something that is very intuitively accepted by many people. It's only, and so what shocks people is when the money looks as being generated entirely by the work of some people and then distributed to other people. And so that's why in a way, the work, the intellectual work that has to be done in order to see a basic income as a way of distributing the sort of substratum of real freedom in a fair way, the exercise that needs to be done is consists in saying, well, it consists in helping people see that how much of the income we earn is not at all ascribable to our merits, to our efforts. I mean, it's given, I mean, it's due to the privilege of living in an affluent country, enjoying all this capital accumulation, this technological innovation, this institutional developments that make it possible for us to earn the income and have the purchasing power which we have. And in addition to that, individually, as many people have pointed out, including Mark Zuckerberg, so much then in terms of how high an income we get in these privileged countries is due to luck, to the fact that at some point in time, well, the talents, the skills we happen to possess corresponded to a demand, or due to the fact that we were spotted by someone who saw the potential we had, and as a result of that, our career developed in a way that was completely different. And so once people see that their own contribution, what they can really be said to deserve, is so small compared to what they themselves are given through their wage, it's only then that the basic income funded out of the whole of the product will seem as legitimate to people as a basic income funded out of the revenues from oil or out of the taxation of carbon emissions. So that's essential. I mean, that's central in the justification I gave in Real Freedom for All. And but it's really central, and it's not easy. I think more and more people start realizing that, but it's still hard to get through, because there is really this idea, well, what I produce through my work.
So maybe a big part of getting people on board with basic income is having them re-examine how they currently get their money and understand that that's, maybe that's not how they think it is. It's the result of, forces greater than themselves. They didn't, create that money and then it was taken from them or something like that.
Yeah, there's this, I don't know whether we quote that, but in the book, but there was this formulation by Gar Alperovitz, I think in sort of popular article in the Journal of the MIT, that said, well, someone whose just done some innovation and is claiming all the income related to this innovation, when in fact this innovation could only be done because before that the computer was invented and electricity was invented, etc. It's like someone who puts a little pebble on the top of the rock of Gibraltar in between the extreme south of Europe. They are just what nearly closes the entrance of the Mediterranean. And so as if someone who puts a little pebble at the top of that rock claims the whole of the rock. And so there is all these things that I don't know, Facebook or Google or whatever, all these things that generate massive amounts of money, of course, were only possible not only because electricity and all the rest were invented, and it's not only due to these inventors, but also to the mummies of these inventors who looked after them, who smiled to them and made sure they became the geniuses they became, rather than some cranks that end up in a psychiatric hospital. So there are all these undetectable contributions to, in fact, what turns out then to be the high incomes we manage to earn if we are sufficiently skilled or have the right skills in our wealthy countries.
Yeah, I think there's this intuition among people that they get paid kind of according to the value they contribute. And especially if you get paid a lot, people want to believe that they contributed a lot of value, that kind of thing. But of course, that's not how the market works. You pay people enough to get them to do the thing, and you don't really want to pay them more than that. It's not going to be based on the actual value of what you did or something like that. And I don't think people are thinking about it that way, right? So obviously we wouldn't want to increase the basic income to such a high amount that it breaks all the incentives and people aren't getting paid enough to do the work that the economy needs. But that's not what people are thinking about when they're thinking about if their wages have to be reduced or something like that. Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to agree that on the surface, people talk about the moral principle of not paying people for nothing, but that's not, there's like more going on than that, right? If you dig into it, and I think Philippe gave some examples, and I'll give a few more that I guess other people also mentioned. So if you inherit money, right, that's okay, to get without working for it. If, like we said, if it's from a natural resource, if it's from some other source, like it seems to be okay. If you paid into the system, if you can't afford to work, obviously, but even if you could work, but you just are independently wealthy, like maybe some people see that as not great, but it's certainly not viewed as a moral catastrophe that we can't handle, because we do it all the time, right? We allow for that all the time. And so I think the surface argument is not immutable or something that people just like deeply, I don't know. I think it is quite changeable based on circumstance, and other things are really behind it. On a rhetorical level, I agree with Philippe that part of what's behind it is the sense that, we can't afford to have people not working because the work is important and we need to incentivize it, and we can't have too many free riders. And so for some reason, people don't have that concern with something like a natural resource or inherited wealth for whatever reason. But so some of it is that, and I think some of it is just what people are used to. So I also wanted to point out that we have other resources that we pay for collectively, even in the United States, where we don't have as many, but we have public schools, we have roads and bridges, we have, in some countries you have healthcare, in the United States we don't, but often people are proponents of national healthcare who aren't proponents of basic income in the United States. So I think a lot of it is what people have seen to be safe and okay and normalized. And it like, as you brought up, Alex, if we were to have basic income be one of those things, I think that this ideology would dissipate pretty quickly. That's my sense. It's similar to how a lot of people don't make that argument about like healthcare or about libraries or about fire departments or other things like that, that you should only, some people do. I mean, extreme libertarians say maybe you should privately pay into the fire department, or they shouldn't come to your house, or don't want libraries and stuff. There are always going to be those people, but I think the vast majority of people are not that fixed, and that their ideologies would change, especially with the implementation. How to get the ideology to change, before the implementation is trickier. And I personally think at the root of it is an anxiety about how to pay for it, which kind of speaks to what Philippe was talking about kind of where the money is coming from. Is it going to come from my tax dollars? Is it going to come from me having to work harder? Is it going to break the whole economy and we all end up worse off? I think these are some real fears that people have. And so I think somehow convincing people of that, which is obviously quite hard, would go a long way, or just implementing it surreptitiously somehow, and then people would get used to it. But yeah, I don't know. Those are some other examples.
Well, I like how at the end of the book you talk about kind of basic income through the back door, through a participation income that's nominally for contributing, but really it goes to everyone because we have a broad definition of contributing, that kind of thing. I wonder if that's how we get there.
Yes. It's likely that that would help, certainly in many contexts. But as Bethany said, I think what helps people then get used to or be less afraid of the idea of basic income is, first of all, to have some element of it. For example, in the form of universal child benefits. So we've had that in a number of countries for quite a while. I hear that in the United States, one is moving in that direction under the Biden administration. So that certainly helps. Also in some countries, less countries than for universal child benefits, you have a universal basic pension, where whatever your career, your past career, whatever your situation, single or not, you get a basic amount that is the same, providing you live in the country. And even in those, then you have the sort of problem I mentioned before for basic income. What about those that go and spend their time as a pensioner, their retirement in different countries? Do they lose that right? And they have to design some arrangements to cover that situation. But then in between, you have, between the children and the pensioners, and you have the working population, the active population. And there you have, indeed, you have several arguments. There is the moral argument. There is, you can't have something if you can't have an income if you do nothing. So what you just mentioned, but also what was mentioned by this member of the leadership of the Dutch Labour Party. But you have different arguments. There is indeed the economic argument that says, oh, yes, but we'll reduce the work incentives too much. And so therefore, we won't be able to pay this basic income to everyone, let alone all the other services. So that's so how strong is this economic argument? So that needs to be discussed. We do so in the economic chapter of our book. And then there is a third argument that says, well, the reason why we can't have a basic income is that work is good for people. And so it's part of a good life. And even though they don't always see it, but really work is good for them. And it's often present. And it's a view that shouldn't be dismissed just by pointing out that this was exactly what was written at the entrance of the concentration camps in Germany. Arbeit macht frei, so work liberates. But of course there is a sense in which being involved in work activity with other people is something important and in a sense good for people. And it's important that everyone should have access to that. But it's certainly a third, and of course, basic income. That's why basic income needs to be universal and not trap people in a situation of exclusion. But it's certainly present. And so we have these three different arguments. There is a moral argument, there's the economic argument of incentives, and then there is this sort of paternalistic arguments that is good for people to work. And then, indeed, as you said, Alex, one way then of addressing this concern consists in saying, okay, yes, it's important for people to work, it's important for them, and there is something in the idea that you can't just be a free rider, you should do something. And but we must realize that useful work is not just wage work or paid work on the market. And so we'll have a broader notion of work, which covers also looking after one's children, looking after all the people, being involved in as a volunteer in an association, perhaps even getting further training for and all this. And so you have that was Tony Atkinson's proposal, the British economist, and so I had a long discussion at Yale with Jim Tobin when I was a visiting professor at Yale. And he also inclined, he said, that both for tactical reasons, that is to make the idea more acceptable in the public debate. And also he said, well, maybe also because of his moral intuitions, it would be better to have this sort of pretty weak, soft work condition, and that. But there, the challenge is how you are going to implement it. And I remember at one of the congresses of BIEN, of the Basic Income Network, there was the chair of the British Associations of Voluntary Organizations who was present, and who said, please don't introduce that sort of participation income. Why? Because you would turn all these voluntary organizations, all these associations that rely on volunteers into agencies of the state that would have to check whether the volunteers were doing their 15 hours a week or and so not only would it burden them with a lot of administrative work, it would also transform the nature of their relationship to their volunteers. So I said, and so although you can see the technical point, and Tony Atkinson initially introduced it not with a moral argument, but with a tactical argument. He said, if you want to sell the idea of universal income in post-Thatcher Britain, in the United Kingdom after Margaret Thatcher, you need to sell it with a condition of this sort and make it sufficiently soft. And it's never been totally clear to me, so I met Tony Atkinson repeatedly before he died too early a few years ago, and never been fully clear to me whether he believed that it would be sustainable, or whether he thought that in fact after a while you would see that it's so costly to do these controls, and in order to just to eliminate, to exclude a few people who anyway may have some health problems, and that you would then soon abandon it. And so it may be important for tactical reasons, political reasons, but then there's some intuition in it. So as we say in the book, it's not that we think that dolce vita, so doing nothing all life long, just watching television, and so can be a life that's worthwhile. Of course, it would be a terrible life, but we believe that the moral sanctions, social sanctions, would be sufficient for people to contribute in this way and have a life of service to others, but that doesn't need to take only the form or mainly the form of wage work, which is often work that is not particularly useful to society.
Yeah. I like to say that the only reason we have such a thing as a job is because there's some work that people won't do unless you pay them, but then there's plenty of work that they will do. So there's no reason to try to force everyone into the labor category. So we're at the end of our time. Quickly, maybe tell us what's next for you. What are you working on?
I have many fronts. For example, this coming month, there are various celebrations of the 50th anniversary of John Rawls's theory of justice. So there are some conferences organized. I'm going to one in Spain and to one in France. But I have also one major, including academic interest, which is in linguistic justice. I published a book with Oxford University Press 10 years ago, and I'm now also the chair of something called the Brussels Council for Multilingualism. And so this is something I'm interested in for a long time, also for personal reasons. I have 4 children, and each of them is, and they're on average quadrilingual, so and have married people who speak even more languages. So I'm interested in that for that reason, but also because my country is an officially trilingual country, and living together when people don't speak the same language is even more difficult than when they speak the same language. And so, Brussels is a city where 2/3 of the inhabitants are either foreigners or of foreign origin. So social cohesion, but also economic dynamism is highly dependent on language, and that's also a matter of social justice dimension that's quite different from basic income, but the overarching concern for social justice is what has been guiding me throughout, both in my political engagements and in my academic work.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Philippe. And the book, for anyone out there on YouTube watching, again, is Basic Income, a Radical Proposal for a Free Society and a Sane Economy. This was fantastic. I've been, interested in your work for a long time, so it's nice to finally have a discussion with you. And good luck with the language justice. That also sounds fascinating. And I like that you have a single overarching theme that connects everything you're working on.
Yeah, thanks so much, Philippe.
And then next week, we have our final one of these. We're going to be back at our normal time at 7 p.m. Eastern, and we're going to go for 2 hours and just talk about whatever we want to talk about with respect to Boston Basic Income. So thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Bye.